Thank you. Thank you very much. I know the next 12 weeks of my campaign are going to be very tough. And I know my wife Nancy, she always tells me she's going to be sitting in that rocking chair, eating a piece of fruit, and she's going to be sitting on my lap. And I've been through this process before, and I expect to sit in that chair in about 2 weeks, and then I'll start rocking. And I know the majority of you guys here are 90% Democrat. I myself used to be a Democrat, but then decided things needed to change. We've had the New Deal, then Harry Truman gave us a fair deal, and now we have a misdeal. But I don't know if you feel as I do right now when they talk about balancing the sheets in Washington. It makes me feel as if I'm sitting in a restaurant, and I order, and I know I don't have enough money to pay for it. I look in my pockets and have nothing, and I still order, but he's hoping, maybe, he'll find a pearl in his oysters. This once proud country, the country that all the world would turn to and look to as the shelter, as the safety. Today, our friends don't know whether they can trust us, and certainly our enemies have no respect for us. One of the greatest tragedies here in California was the creation of bureaucracies. People are there just because they prefer to be there. People don't want jobs instead, but the bureaucracy has them so economically trapped that they can't get away. Programs much like education should be given back to the states instead of the federal government, with tax sources to fund them. I believe in state rights. I believe in people doing as much as they can for themselves at the community level and at the private level. And I believe we move this toward the balance of our government by giving power to this administrative policy-making group that was never intended in the Constitution to that federal establishment. And if I do win, I'm going to devote myself and try to reorder those priorities to the states and local communities which properly belong there. Lastly, I'm going to lower federal income taxes. This country was once upon one of the greatest countries with the best productivity rate, one of the best in the nations, in the world, but the U.S. economy has fallen short, and I'm going to devote myself in trying to reorder our state of economy and put us back where we belong.
Well, that concludes Reagan's speech from the motion 1981. Now we have our guest speaker, Mr. Greenberg. Good morning, Mr. Greenberg.
Good morning, Cindy. Man, that Reagan dude is a dog whistling Dixie. He talks to the public in a coded language which makes him look like he's referring to everyone when he says states' rights, when in reality he's targeting a specific subgroup. The phrase states' rights literally refers to the power of the individual state government in the United States. Reagan uses it as code words for institutionalized segregation and racism. States' rights was the banner under which groups like the Defenders of State Sovereignty and Individual Liberties argued in 1955 against school desegregation. In 1981, a former Republican Party strategist, Lee Atwater, said that by 1968, you can't say the N-word. It hurts you. It backfires. You say stuff like forced busing, states' right, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things that you're talking about are economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. Consciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, we are not solving the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a lot more abstract than saying the N-word.
Alright, well, okay, so why do you think Reagan's strategies at the time were so unlawful?
You need to understand that by 1980 or so, the civil rights movement had for the most part established a racial equality as an undisputed good. Only in the furthest reaches of American political culture did public figures dare to make a nakedly racist appeal anymore.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that George Wallace famously renounced his racist past, that is, rejected his past racial self. And as governor of Alabama in the 1980s, weren't there some people who tried to avoid the topic? Wasn't that effective?
Just because some highly ranking official rejected the topic of racism, it doesn't mean that America had attained the end of racism. For one thing, intolerance definitely continued to fester privately in sentiments and stereotypes that people were unwilling to share with reporters or pollsters. We see it with Reagan's rhetoric and ideology. Racial inequalities had become intricately woven into many policies and structures of the American life. That is why it's so important to really carefully look at Reagan's speech and analyze his real intentions when he mentions states' rights.
Okay, so how much of an influence did Reagan's subtle text have in supporting his election in 1981?
Arguably, it comes close to stating that Reagan came to power because of America, or at least the southern part, is racist at his heart. The white people wanted a ruler like Reagan so they could gain more power and force the blacks to relive the slave life. And this is exactly what Reagan was aiming for, to gain the white support so he can be president.
Okay, right. At this time, most of America did indeed have the mindset, but it also has to do with the political forces during this time.
I assume you're talking about the evangelical groups?
Yes, the evangelical groups. Ideologies correlated with Reagan's ideologies as they were based on conservative principles, which the evangelical groups really liked.
Right. But would you say that this was significant for his success in taking office?
Well, it is quite significant since 61% of the people who voted for Reagan were evangelicals.
Although this was the case, do you think that Reagan influenced other groups of people to vote for him?
Well, yeah, definitely. Reagan was a charismatic public speaker. He had a very good understanding of what the people wanted and made most out of the situations. He was very careful in using controversial family issues to his greatest political advantage as well.
I agree with you on that, but would you care to explain the situations in which he made the most out of a particular situation?
Yes, of course. So during his term as governor of California, he positioned himself as a supporter of the ERA. But when it came to his presidency, many people during that time were opposed to the ERA. And so in order to win the people's votes and the favor of his party, he decided to oppose the ERA.
So now you mentioned that he was for the idea of traditional marriages, and I want to know how he got so many people who were non-evangelicals to agree with him as well.
Oh, okay. So, well, I did mention that Reagan was very good at understanding his audience, and with this power, he was able to recognize that nostalgia was a very powerful force in politics. And Reagan compared the good old days of traditional marriage to the corrupt modern families. And specifically, he made a huge impact on the music industry.
Really? So how so?
Well, during his presidency, many of the music contained violent and sexual content, which to many parents, this supported the idea that the modern society is indeed corrupt. And this support causes the parents to become much more concerned for their children, and thus the creation of Parents Music Resource Center was made to stop children from listening to music that contained sexual and violent content.
Wow. But wouldn't it be hard for parents to stop every single children from listening to music?
Well, it would be, but their idea was to get the recording industry to adopt a voluntary rating system for music and recordings.
Were they able to succeed?
Yes and no. By August 1985, nearly 20 record companies had agreed to put labels on their recordings indicating explicit lyrics. However, this situation caused many parents to become Reagan's supporter, but many people in the music industry rejected it, saying that it was censorship and lack of freedom.
Oh, interesting. He wasn't able to convince every white citizen as I thought he may have been able to.
Indeed, so it would be impossible to convince everyone due to their matter of opinion. And so going back to what you've mentioned, you kind of touched upon this, but in my opinion, what was so wrong about Reagan's subtle language, or a dog whistle as you would call it?
Reagan's dog whistle was a whistle to the segregationists, the subtle language linked to insidious racial stereotypes. His image and appeal was shot through with hostility, assisting minorities with positive measures like welfare programs, which mainly helped the whites but were perceived as helping the blacks.
Okay, wrapping up our interview for today, what are your final thoughts on Reagan's subtle approach during the 1980s? What significant influence did he leave on the audience with his tacit racial messages?
When talking about domestic government spending, public opposition to spending was most intense when it came to the programs devoted to the needy and to the blacks. This showed the immense effect Reagan has had on the public opinion, and in later years other political leaders catched on his language, which showed that the racism is just smears and slurs. This discredited the entire discussion by making it about personal prejudice rather than public policy.
Right. Well, Mr. Greenberg, thank you so much for sparing your time to join us today, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you for having me.
Hello guys, in today's episode we'll be covering chapter 31 section 1 with Elizabeth.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you for having me today. Today we'll be talking about the 80s from chapter 31, section 1. Everything from activist groups to the fall of communism in Germany to Reaganomics, to even the man Reagan himself. Firstly, I'll start off by asking, who exactly is Reagan? Well, for starters, Ronald Reagan was born on February 6, 1911, to parents Nell and John Reagan. He was your average kid, attended all the schools he needed to go to, high school, middle school, and then went off to Dixie College and studied sociology and criminal justice. Soon after he graduated, he began to bring interest in the glitz and glam of Hollywood, and in 1937 he moved to Hollywood to pursue acting. In that same year he became a reserve officer and was part of the motion picture unit for the U.S. Army. Unfortunately, he couldn't actively participate due to poor eyesight. #relatable. Soon after the war, Reagan rose to power within the Screen Actors Guild and was named spokesperson for General Electric. He even made commercials for them. As he gained popularity, Reagan thought, hey, you know what, maybe I should run for governor. And so in 1966, he was a candidate for the Republican Party against Liberal Democrat Pat Brown. And so, what's funny? And that's very ironic.
How so?
Well, funny you asked that, because for most of his life, Reagan was a liberal Democrat. However, due to being in World War I and not being a very big fan of communism, not to mention meeting his second and lucky wife, who was actually a conservative Republican, he soon decided to change from being a Democrat to a Republican in 1964. While against Pat Brown, Reagan talked down on democratic ideals and denounced big government, and insisted on free enterprise. And many people were actually for that, specifically old, rich, white males, somewhere around 40s and up. This is why Reagan was a presidential candidate that won in the 1980s, not only because of a lot of Republicans that agreed with his conservative values, but because of this 52% eligible voters, they actually voted for Reagan, were old, rich, white men. He also wanted to establish his own form of economic ideals, which most people called Reaganomics. And a lot of people actually didn't agree with it. And so you wonder, how does that actually work? So the way it was set up was that the taxes were being cut from the rich. And so they're supposed to trickle down into the middle class and lower class. Unfortunately, that does not work. Well, most people who are rich, I'm not saying all, but most, are not nice and would rather save their money and not give it to, middle class and poor people. So it never actually got down to the lower and middle class, which furthered the gap, and it really didn't do much. And people were not happy about this. People were not happy at the fact that the gap between the rich and the poor increased as time went on. So what did people do? They acted up. People saw a need for representation for groups and minorities that weren't being represented and spoken out on it. One of the most notable groups to act up was the LGBTQ community during the Reagan presidency. They were asking for help from the government due to the disease known as AIDS, that was killing hundreds and hundreds of men and women across the United States.
Yikes.
And Reagan hardly ever spoke on these issues due to the fact that, he was trying to appeal to his Republican people. And Republicans are very conservative, focus a lot on Christian values, and they really didn't care about LGBTQ community because of the fact that it went against their moral values. And unfortunately, because of that, treatment wasn't started until the late 80s and early 90s. And some of them are actually still fighting for it today. And that's about it.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for covering chapter 31, section 1.
Thank you.
Hello guys, in today's episode we'll be covering chapter 31, section 3 with Aya.
It's great being here, everyone. Reagan came into office wanting to restore America's reputation. He attempted to do this by including America in foreign events.
Oh really? Like what? What did he intervene in?
Well, one thing that he did was send troops to Lebanon trying to restore order after the Israeli invasion. He tried to place order and peace in Lebanon, but in 1983, 200 US soldiers were bombed and killed by Hezbollah, Iranian militants.
Stop the madness. How did Reagan react to that?
This caused Reagan to withdraw troops from Lebanon. He realized that placing troops in Lebanon wasn't worth losing his soldiers for.
Interesting. Where else did he intervene in?
He also tried to outrule communist military in Grenada, Cuba, by intervening over there. Luckily, Cuban soldiers surrendered after 2 days, so a win for the U.S. The U.S. intervention in Cuba was intended to warn Marxists in Central America.
Wow. So how did the government in Central America feel like or about this?
Many Latin American governments were discontented and upset. In El Salvador, a military junta was put in power that was involved in a civil war against left-leaning guerrillas when Reagan took office, who supported a right-wing government. Nicaragua was also governed by a Marxist group led by Daniel Ortega, the Sandinistas, who overthrew the right-wing dictatorship. Reagan then allowed the CIA to train a group of anti-Sandinista Nicaraguans known as the Contras. In 1980, Iraq invaded Iran and began to be gaining the upper hand. By 1982, they needed weapons, so the U.S. provided them with money, arms, and military intelligence.
Nice. So why did Reagan help them? What did he gain out of it?
He did this because of his desire to aid the Contras, helping the enemy of its enemy. In 1983, Americans were captured by Hezbollah forces in Lebanon, so Reagan was pretty much forced to aid Iran in exchange for retrieving the 3 American hostages. But a year after this, President Reagan's National Security Council aide, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, found a way to sell weapons to Iran and secretly used the proceeds to support the Contras, violating a congressional ban on aid to the Contras.
They eventually got caught though, right?
Yeah, they did, but they were able to get away with it because of the presidential pardon. Reagan was able to get himself out of a situation like this because he had a reputation of being a lenient leader, so it was...
That's crazy. They were able to get away with such a big thing.
Yeah. So on to the Cold War, Reagan spent enormous amounts of money trying to upgrade the advancement of the weapons that the U.S. had. In 1983, Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which called for the development of a defensive shield to protect the United States from a Soviet missile strike.
Wait, you're telling me that Reagan basically wanted to build a protective bubble around the U.S.? Is that even possible?
Yep, pretty much. Scientists argued that the type of technology had not yet been invented and might never be. If it would be possible, it would have estimated to be cost about $7.5 billion and taken several years to be built. It was also argued that his plan would violate existing treaties with the Soviet Union and worried about the Soviets' response. It just wasn't worth it, so the plan was abandoned.
Wait. So what happened between the U.S. and the Soviet Union?
So Reagan started to lighten things up with the Soviet Union because of his new peer, Mikhail Gorbachev, who wanted to prevent another arms race. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty at the White House, which limited nuclear weapons.
Wait. So tell me a little bit about the 1998 election.
Sure. Republican George W. Bush and Democrat Michael Dukakis ran for 1998 election. Bush political advisor Lee Atwater created rumors about Dukakis, claiming he was soft on crime and connecting his liberal policies to a brutal murder in Massachusetts, which sabotaged Dukakis' reputation and allowed Bush to win the election. However, although Bush won, he was in a really tough spot, wanting to keep the people happy but the country financially stable, which didn't exactly go hand in hand.
Wait, so what did the people want?
Okay, well, Bush promised to maintain Reagan's policy and create no new taxes, but the problems he faced made it difficult. Reagan's policies of cutting taxes and increasing defense spending had exploited the federal budget deficit, making it 3 times larger.
Wow, that's tough. How could he satisfy everybody? Was he able to come up with a solution?
Well, the Democratic Congress wanted to raise taxes for the rich, while Republicans thought government should cut domestic spending. Bush ended up creating the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. This act created a budget that included measures to reduce the shortage by both cutting government expenditures and raising taxes, breaking Bush's promise of no new taxes.
Wait, so what else did Bush aim to do?
Bush also sought to ease tension with the Soviet Union, stressing the need for peace and cooperation between the 2 superpowers.
What about in the Middle East?
Iraq began to suffer economically because of surrounding Middle Eastern countries becoming rich in oil production, driving Iraq down. Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein approached these oil-producing countries for assistance, particularly Saudi Arabia and neighboring Kuwait. However, both countries turned away from Iraq, so Iraq's leader Saddam Hussein ordered invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. Bush gathered 34 other countries in NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and warned Iraq that if they did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991, they would face serious consequences.
How did Iraq respond to that?
Iraq ignored this warning and proceeded to invade Kuwait.
What did it result in?
This resulted in Operation Desert Storm, a 100-hour land war involving over 500,000 U.S. troops and another 200,000 from 27 other countries, which expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait by the end of February.
But was the rest of the world okay with this?
Well, since the land war was a success, it was seen as a legitimate action by many around the world. Following this, Bush and the Democratic Senate broke new ground in civil rights with his support of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a far-reaching law that prohibited discrimination based on disability in public accommodations and by employers. Also, sexual harassment of women in the workplace gained public attention.
Well, thank you, Aya. Thanks for sharing this information with us.
In today's episode, we'll be talking about Chapter 31, Section 4.
So Chapter 31, Section 4, it talks about Bill Clinton taking office and his administration policies. So we begin in 1922. George W. Bush was president at the time, and many people doubted him because he wasn't able to solve America's problems. But when Bill Clinton won office in 1922, he was running as a new Democrat, and Democrats took control of both houses of Congress. Clinton's administration quickly started making changes in the economy. Since Clinton took office towards the end of a recession, his plans for fixing the economy included limited spending and cutting budgets to reduce the nation's deficits. Clinton also tried to improve employment opportunities by putting money into education. But Clinton didn't stop there. He expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit, which lowered taxes for working families who were below poverty line. An agreement to protect workers to protect the environment was added in the ratifications of NAFTA. 1993. The nation began to experience the longest period of economic expansion in history, and Clinton's administration became the first to launch an official White House website and join the revolution in a new technological change. Clinton also addressed some of the domestic issues. Clinton's plan for healthcare reform included universal coverage for all Americans, but that was quickly disregarded with the lack of support from Republicans and Democrats. So the healthcare bill was never passed and it died in Congress. Once Clinton became president, he promised to end the ban on gays and lesbians serving in the military. However, to appease conservatives, he wasn't able to do that, and instead he added a new policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, meaning that gays and lesbians who were serving in active duty, they were not allowed to talk about their sexual orientation, and they weren't allowed to discuss it. So Clinton at first was against same-sex couples. However, later on, he called the Defense of Marriage Act for its repeal, and he appointed openly gays and lesbians to important positions in government. Towards the end of Clinton's presidency, he had a very scandalous affair. Many rumors arose about affairs, but finally, Bush was accused of sexual harassment by Paula Jones, a former Arkansas state employee. Clinton denied all accusations, but until other alleged victims were brought to light, Monica Lewinsky was a turning point in the case against President Clinton. Clinton committed perjury and denied all accusations. In February 1998, Clinton was the first president to be found in contempt of court, and he lost his law license and left office, but everybody still loved him and he was still a very popular president. In the election of 2000 was one of the most controversial elections. This election included Al Gore versus George W. Bush. On Tuesday, November 7th of 2000, the election day was a very close race all night. The race came down to whoever took Florida's 25 electoral votes, but when the votes were too close to call, they asked for a recount. However, during the recount in Florida, numbers were dropping against Bush because they were counting all the ballots by hand, and they had to dispute the ones that had inaccurate hole punching. Finally, 19 days passed Election Day, and the Supreme Court took control and ordered the recounting to be stopped by a 5-4 vote. Florida's Supreme Court had the final say, but they dismissed the case and George W. Bush was awarded the electoral votes and took presidency. However, the craziness did not stop there. Gore's supporters blamed the U.S. Supreme Court because there was 5 conservative justices and 4 liberal justices. Therefore, they believed they took the side of Bush. This rose suspicion because Gore was the first one in 112 years to lose the electoral vote but win the popular vote. This happens again in 2016 when Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 2.9 million votes but won the electoral vote against Hillary Clinton.
Alrighty guys, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you for having me.
Yep.